Let me tell you about a study that caught me completely off guard when I first read it. And I say that as someone who has spent 15 years reviewing postmenopausal health research. The study followed over 1,400 adults for 21 years, starting in midlife. At the end of those 21 years, the women who had consumed 3 to 5 cups of caffeinated coffee per day showed a 65% lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to low coffee consumers. 65%. And the effect was stronger in women than in men. I'm Dr. Helen Marlowe, and before I go any further, I need to address something directly. Because if you've watched other videos on this channel, you may already be thinking, wait, didn't she say that too much caffeine is a problem after menopause? She did. I did. And both things are true. The dose is the entire story. In a previous episode, I explained why 4 or more cups of coffee per day significantly amplifies the cortisol stress response in postmenopausal women. Because estrogen normally buffers that response, and without estrogen, the same amount of caffeine hits the nervous system harder. That is real, and that hasn't changed. What I want to explore today is what the research shows about moderate coffee consumption, 1 to 3 cups per day, because the evidence here is genuinely surprising and genuinely relevant. Not as a treatment for anything, not as a substitute for anything, but as a daily habit that may be doing considerably more than you think, through biological mechanisms that most physicians have never had time to explain in the context of menopause. Let me start with the myth I want to dismantle, because it shapes how a lot of women relate to their morning coffee. The myth is this: coffee is neutral at best, mildly harmful at worst, and any benefit is just from the caffeine keeping you awake. That framing is incomplete to the point of being misleading, because it ignores the fact that coffee is one of the most complex mixtures of bioactive compounds in the human diet. A single cup of filtered coffee contains over 1,000 distinct chemical compounds, including chlorogenic acids, caffeistol, caweol, trigonylene, and melanoidins. The caffeine is just the one we happen to study first. Here's what happens when you drink your morning coffee in the liver. And this part is worth paying attention to, because the liver is where your residual estrogen metabolism happens after menopause. Even after menopause, your body still produces small amounts of estrogen. It comes primarily from 2 sources: adrenal glands, which secrete androgen precursors, and fat tissue, where an enzyme called aromatase converts those precursors into estrone, the predominant postmenopausal estrogen. That residual estrogen then travels to the liver for processing, and the liver has 2 main routes it can use: hydroxylation at the C2 position, producing 2-hydroxyestrone, which researchers classify as the protective metabolite, or hydroxylation at the C16 alpha position, producing 16-alpha-hydroxyestrone, which is associated with greater proliferative activity in estrogen-sensitive tissue. The enzyme responsible for the protective route, the C2 pathway, is called CYP1A2. And chlorogenic acids, the primary polyphenols in coffee, are CYP1A2 inducers. They activate the transcription factors that upregulate this enzyme, effectively opening more lanes on the highway toward the protective estrogen metabolite. A study published in Drug Metabolism and Disposition confirmed this mechanism through direct measurement of CYP1A2 activity following chlorogenic acid exposure. A 2010 cancer research study of nearly 2,000 postmenopausal women found that regular caffeinated coffee consumption was associated with measurably lower circulating estrone and estradiol levels compared to non-coffee drinkers. And the key point is that this reduction in circulating estrogen corresponds to the protective metabolite route being more active, meaning the estrogen is being cleared more efficiently toward the safer destination. This is the same pathway, incidentally, that cruciferous vegetables act on through their DIM content. Coffee and broccoli are working the same biological road. One of the more unexpected convergences in postmenopausal nutrition research. Now, what about the brain? Because that opening statistic about Alzheimer's disease requires a mechanism, and there is one. When caffeine blocks adenosine A1 receptors in the brain, which is how it produces alertness, the downstream effect includes increasing cyclic AMP inside neurons, which activates a transcription factor called CREB. CREB, when activated, upregulates brain-derived neurotrophic factor, abbreviated BDNF. BDNF is essentially fertilizer for neuronal connections. It promotes synaptic plasticity, supports the growth of new neural connections, and has been shown to inhibit the accumulation of beta amyloid, one of the proteins associated with Alzheimer's pathology. Here's why this matters specifically after menopause. Estrogen was one of the primary drivers of hippocampal BDNF production. The hippocampus is the brain region most centrally involved in memory formation, and it contains a high density of estrogen receptors precisely because estrogen was regulating BDNF there. When estrogen drops, BDNF production in the hippocampus drops with it. The brain fog, the word-finding difficulties, the sense that your memory isn't quite reliable. These are downstream consequences of reduced BDNF in a region that has just lost its primary stimulant. Moderate caffeine is not a replacement for estrogen's neurological effects, but it activates a parallel BDNF pathway through the CREB mechanism that becomes more important precisely because estrogen is no longer doing it. A 2009 study from the Women's Health Initiative Memory Substudy, examining cognitive trajectories in postmenopausal women, found that women consuming 1 to 2 cups of caffeinated coffee daily showed slower decline on verbal fluency and memory tests compared to non-consumers. The effect was modest but consistent, and the CADE study's 21-year longitudinal data suggests the protective effect compounds over time, which makes biological sense if the mechanism involves daily BDNF stimulation. The third area, bones, is where the nuance is most important, and I want to be careful here because the bone coffee research is widely misunderstood. A large longitudinal study of over 30,000 Swedish women, published in Osteoporosis International, found that high coffee intake, 4 or more cups per day, was associated with slightly lower bone mineral density at the lumbar spine. That sounds alarming. It's also where the nuance matters enormously, because when the researchers stratified the data by calcium intake, the bone-negative association was present only in women with calcium intake below 700 milligrams per day. In women with adequate calcium intake, above 1,000 milligrams daily, even 4 cups of coffee per day showed no negative bone effect, 0. The mechanism is straightforward. Caffeine is a mild diuretic, and it slightly increases renal calcium excretion. Each cup of coffee causes the loss of approximately 5 milligrams of calcium through the urine. At 2 cups per day, that's 10 milligrams, a tiny fraction of a calcium-replete diet, meaninglessly offset by any single calcium-containing food. The problem arises only when caffeine's calcium drain operates on a bucket that is already nearly empty. Fill the bucket first, and the caffeine effect on bone becomes physiologically irrelevant. I tell women this when they're worried about their morning coffee and their bones. Make sure you're getting calcium from food and supplements totaling at least 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams per day. Maintain your vitamin D levels in the 40 to 60 nanogram per milliliter range. And your moderate coffee habit is not a bone risk. It may actually be contributing to your bone health indirectly through its anti-inflammatory liver effects. There is another consideration I want to mention, because it changes how you prepare your coffee, and it has a direct cardiovascular relevance. Coffee contains compounds called diterpenes, specifically cafestol and kaweol, that are present in unfiltered coffee preparations, including French press, espresso, and Turkish coffee. These diterpenes raise LDL cholesterol through a specific hepatic mechanism. Filtered coffee, drip coffee made with a paper filter, largely removes them. For postmenopausal women, for whom cardiovascular risk rises with estrogen loss, the cardiovascular risk profile of your coffee is better managed through paper-filtered preparation. The chlorogenic acids and the caffeine pass through the filter. The LDL-raising diterpenes mostly don't. The practical protocol based on this evidence: 1 to 3 cups of filtered caffeinated coffee per day, consumed before noon. The before-noon timing matters for two reasons. First, because caffeine has a half-life of approximately 5 to 6 hours, meaning a cup consumed at 3 in the afternoon still has significant caffeine activity in your system at 8 or 9 at night, when you need to be winding down for sleep. And sleep quality in postmenopausal women is already compromised by estrogen loss, affecting the hypothalamic temperature regulation that governs sleep architecture. Second, because anchoring caffeine to the morning aligns with your cortisol awakening response, the natural cortisol surge that occurs in the first hour after waking. So you're not attempting to override your biology's own alertness mechanism. Morning coffee works with the circadian system. Afternoon coffee increasingly works against it. Minimize sugar additives. I say this not because a teaspoon of honey is catastrophic, but because the evidence on insulin and aromatase in postmenopausal adipose tissue, which I've covered in other episodes, makes elevated sugar habits meaningfully counterproductive to the hormonal metabolic work that moderate coffee is supporting. Cinnamon is a reasonable additive if you like sweetness without the glycemic impact. It has independent evidence for blood sugar modulation. Low-fat dairy or unsweetened plant milk are both fine. For women taking levothyroxine for thyroid conditions, caffeine within 1 hour of your thyroid medication reduces its absorption by approximately 30%. Take levothyroxine first, on an empty stomach. Wait 60 minutes before your coffee and before food. Build your morning routine around that window, not around the coffee window. For women with cardiac arrhythmia, particularly atrial fibrillation, the evidence on coffee and arrhythmia is more mixed than you might expect. Moderate coffee consumption does not reliably trigger arrhythmia in most people. But individual sensitivity varies considerably, and the decision should be made in conversation with your cardiologist rather than based on population averages. For women with significant GERD or acid reflux, coffee is a sphincter relaxant as well as an acid stimulant, and it's a genuine trigger for many reflux sufferers. Decaffeinated coffee retains the chlorogenic acids responsible for the CYP1A2 and liver effects I described, with lower acid stimulation, and may be a viable alternative for the hormone metabolism and bone benefits without the GI cost. The cognitive BDNF benefit, however, depends on caffeine specifically, not polyphenols alone. The broader picture here is something I find genuinely compelling about postmenopausal health research. The systems interact in ways that make simple substitutions too reductive. Coffee is not good or bad. It is a complex mixture that acts on multiple biological pathways simultaneously, and the net effect depends on dose, timing, preparation, and the broader dietary and hormonal context in which it's consumed. A woman with adequate calcium, adequate vitamin D, stable sleep, and 1 to 2 cups of filtered coffee before noon is in a meaningfully different biological situation than a woman with calcium deficiency, chronic sleep disruption, and 4 cups of coffee throughout the day. Same beverage, different outcomes. The research tells us that coffee's effects on the postmenopausal brain, specifically the BDNF Alzheimer's connection, are probably the most robustly supported of the 3 mechanisms I've described today. And they're also the longest-term benefits. The 21-year CADE study suggests this is a cumulative protection that builds over decades. That framing changes how I think about my morning cup. Not as a crutch, not as a treat, but as a daily interaction with specific biological pathways that matter more, not less, as estrogen's influence recedes. We started today with what I called the myth that coffee is neutral, a harmless habit that does nothing beyond the caffeine stimulation. The research reveals something considerably more interesting. Moderate filtered coffee consumption interacts with estrogen metabolism through CYP1A2, supports BDNF-driven neurological resilience through the caffeine CREB pathway, and is bone neutral in women with adequate calcium intake. None of this makes coffee medicine. It makes it a daily habit worth understanding rather than feeling vaguely guilty about. What made a difference in how I think about this is not any single study. It's the convergence of multiple independent research lines pointing in the same direction. When the liver metabolism data and the neurological data and the bone epidemiology all resolve into a coherent picture at moderate doses, that's worth paying attention to. Comment below and tell me, are you a coffee drinker? Have you ever been told by a doctor or in a health article that you should cut it out? I'm curious how widespread that advice has been, because what the evidence shows is considerably more nuanced. And if you want to understand the other side of this, specifically what happens when caffeine intake crosses the threshold into too much, that video is also on this channel, and the two together give you the complete picture. I'll see you in the next one. Dr. Marlowe.